I never thought I'd end up working as a night janitor, especially in a place like that. The theater, once a crown jewel of the city, was now a hollow shell of its former self. You could feel its history the moment you stepped inside. The heavy velvet curtains that still hung in tatters, the dust that coated every surface like a layer of forgotten memories, and the rows of cracked leather seats that once held audiences in awe. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but it was easy money. My instructions were straightforward: keep the place tidy, and make sure no one wandered in during the night. The owners were still figuring out what to do with it, but judging by the state of the place, I doubted they'd find a buyer anytime soon. The nights were eerily quiet. I don't mean the kind of quiet you get in an empty house. I mean the kind that sits heavy on your chest. Every sound felt magnified: the creak of a floorboard, the faint hum of the old fluorescent lights, and occasionally, the distant groan of the building settling. I used to bring headphones to drown it out, but it only made things worse. Without the natural sounds, you'd start imagining footsteps or whispers. So I left my ears open and got used to the silence. Most nights, I'd sweep the corridors, check the dressing rooms, and lock up the side doors. The only time I had to step onto the stage was to turn off the main lights, which always left me with the odd feeling that someone was watching from the shadows of the balcony. It was on my third or fourth night that the weirdness started. I had just finished sweeping the backstage area and was making my way toward the main stage to shut off the lights. As I approached, I noticed something odd. The overhead stage lights were already on. That was strange because I distinctly remembered turning them off when I arrived. At first, I chalked it up to a wiring issue. The place was old, and the electrical system was probably hanging on by a thread. I climbed onto the stage, squinting under the harsh glow, and flipped the switches off again. I told myself it was nothing, but as I turned to leave, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone, or something, was watching me. I glanced up at the empty seats, half expecting to see someone sitting there, but there was nothing. Just rows of darkness and dust. That same night, I heard the first sound. It started as I was sweeping one of the aisles in the auditorium. It was faint at first, almost like a low hum, but it quickly grew into what sounded like muffled voices. My first instinct was that someone had broken in. The thought of some squatters or thrill-seeking teenagers hanging around didn't exactly thrill me, so I grabbed my flashlight and followed the noise. It seemed to be coming from the stage. As I got closer, the voices stopped. It was dead silent again. I climbed onto the stage and shone my flashlight into the wings, calling out, "Hello." My voice echoed, bouncing off the empty walls, but no one answered. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. By the following night, I was already feeling on edge. Every creak and groan of the old building seemed amplified, like it was trying to get my attention. While I was checking the dressing rooms, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the mirrors had fresh handprints on it, smudged and oily, as if someone had pressed their palms against the glass. The thing is, I never saw anyone come in, and I was the only person with a key. My immediate thought was that someone had broken in again, but when I checked the locks, they were all secure. The prints themselves were strange, larger than normal hands, with long, almost claw-like fingers. I wiped them off and tried to shake it from my mind, convincing myself it had to be an old smudge I'd somehow missed before. Then came the sound of footsteps. Not the random creaks of the old floorboards, but deliberate, rhythmic steps, like someone pacing just out of sight. I froze, my broom gripped tightly in one hand as I strained to listen. The sound came from above, from the catwalk that ran high over the stage. My flashlight trembled as I pointed it upward, but the beam revealed nothing but rusting metal and dust motes floating in the stale air. Still, the steps continued, steady and unhurried. I called out, "Who's there?" The sound stopped immediately, and for a moment, the silence felt heavier than the noise. That silence didn't last long. As I stood there, staring up at the catwalk, something else began to creep into my ears. It was faint at first, like a distant melody carried on a breeze, but it grew louder with each passing second. Someone was whistling. The tune was slow and mournful, like an old folk song, the kind that gives you chills even when you don't know why. It was coming from the direction of the dressing rooms. My heart pounded as I forced my legs to move. The idea of someone lurking back there, unseen, was terrifying, but leaving it unchecked felt worse. As I approached, the whistling abruptly stopped. All I could hear was the faint buzz of the overhead lights and my own breathing. I checked every dressing room, my flashlight cutting through the thick shadows, but they were empty. Still, there was something off. On one of the makeup tables, I found a program. It wasn't anything I'd seen before, no modern logos or dates, just the name of a play I didn't recognize and a cast list that made no sense. The names looked foreign, almost alien, written in a flowing script that seemed more like a decorative pattern than actual letters. At the bottom, in bolder writing, were the words "Final Performance." I stood there staring at it, my skin crawling. When I looked up, the mirror above the table had fogged over, as though someone had breathed on it. Slowly, faint words appeared in the condensation, "You're late." I stumbled backward, almost dropping my flashlight, and bolted out of the dressing room. My mind was racing. Maybe it was a prank, I thought. Maybe some squatters were messing with me. But deep down, I knew that didn't explain the handprints, the voices, or the strange program. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't. The doors were locked, and I had a job to do. I forced myself to continue my rounds, though every creak and shadow seemed to mock me. As I moved through the corridors, I felt an overwhelming sense of being followed, though each time I turned, the hallway was empty. It was like the building itself was alive, watching, waiting. Later that night, the stage lights came on again, this time brighter than ever, illuminating every corner of the old theater. I stood frozen in the middle of the aisle, staring at the glowing stage. The faint sound of applause echoed through the room. It wasn't loud, more like a soft, scattered clapping, as though a small audience was politely applauding a performance I couldn't see. Then came the voices. They weren't loud or clear, more like overlapping whispers coming from every direction. My skin prickled as I realized they weren't speaking in English, or any language I recognized. It sounded ancient, guttural, almost like a chant. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the floor as the voices grew louder, rising and falling in an eerie rhythm. Then, as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. The theater fell silent again, but this time it was worse. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your ears, heavy and unnatural. That's when I saw them. Shadows began to form on the stage, just beyond the reach of the lights. At first, they were faint, like tricks of the eye, but they grew darker and more defined with each passing second. Humanoid shapes, tall and thin, their movements fluid and deliberate, like they were rehearsing some macabre performance. One of the figures stepped forward, closer to the edge of the stage, and I swear it looked straight at me, even though it didn't have a face. Just a smooth, blank surface where its features should have been. My body finally responded, and I stumbled backward, tripping over one of the aisle's broken chairs. The sound must have startled it, or maybe I was just imagining that it noticed, because it tilted its head, as if curious, and then stepped back into the group. The figures continued their silent rehearsal, their movements perfectly synchronized, but there was no music, no sound except for my ragged breathing and the occasional creak of the stage boards beneath their feet. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, watching those figures move like actors preparing for a show. The rhythm of their movements was almost hypnotic, but it didn't feel random. There was an unsettling precision to everything they did, like they were following an unseen conductor or an ancient script. Just as I was beginning to think they'd ignore me, all of them stopped at once. Every figure turned toward me, their faceless heads fixed in my direction. My chest tightened, and I felt the air around me grow heavier, colder. I scrambled to my feet, barely managing to stay upright, and bolted toward the exit. When I reached the lobby, I grabbed the main doors, but they wouldn't budge. I tugged harder, desperate, but it was like the building itself was holding them shut. Then I noticed something. The posters on the walls weren't the same. They were old, yellowed with age, advertising plays I'd never heard of. And at the center of each poster was an image of me. Not as I was now, but dressed in some kind of ornate costume, standing under a spotlight. The title beneath my image read, "The Final Act." My hands shook as I stepped away, the sensation of unseen eyes crawling all over me. I backed away from the posters, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mind raced with every possible explanation. Maybe I was dreaming, or someone was playing an elaborate joke. But deep down, I knew it was neither. As I turned to head back to the auditorium, a deafening sound filled the air. It was applause, loud, thunderous, and coming from every direction. The theater vibrated with it, as if a full house had suddenly materialized. My legs felt like jelly, but something compelled me to move. Against all reason, I walked back toward the stage. Each step felt heavier, like I was being pulled by invisible strings. When I reached the stage, the lights blazed brighter than ever, blinding me momentarily. I raised my arm to shield my eyes, and when I lowered it, the figures were no longer just shadows. They were fully formed now, dressed in tattered, old-fashioned costumes that seemed to shimmer under the stage lights. Their faces were still featureless, but somehow I could feel their focus on me. One of them extended an arm, beckoning. I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was like I'd lost control, my feet dragging me forward as if I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Before I knew it, I was standing at the center of the stage. The heat from the overhead lights was oppressive, making sweat bead on my forehead, but I couldn't wipe it away. My arms felt like they were weighed down by invisible chains. The applause stopped abruptly, plunging the theater into a silence that was somehow worse than the noise. The figures surrounded me now, forming a circle, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them stepped forward, holding what looked like an old, worn mask. It was grotesque, with exaggerated features that seemed to shift slightly in the light. The figure raised the mask toward me, and though it had no face, I could feel it urging me to take it. I fought against whatever was pulling me, but it was like trying to swim against a current. My hands moved on their own, reaching out to take the mask. As soon as my fingers touched it, the entire theater seemed to come alive. The lights began flickering in a rhythmic pattern, and the whispers returned, louder this time, their overlapping voices forming a chaotic, incomprehensible chant. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt like I was no longer in the theater. Instead, I was somewhere vast and dark, surrounded by an audience I couldn't see but could feel, their collective gaze pressing down on me like a physical weight. Just as I thought I couldn't take the pressure anymore, the chanting stopped, and I was back on the stage. The mask was gone from my hands, but the figures remained, their movements now frantic and chaotic, as if they were preparing for some final act. The oppressive silence returned, broken only by the faint sound of the curtains slowly creaking open behind me. I turned, dreading what I might see. The theater's seats, which had been empty moments ago, were now filled with shadowy silhouettes. Their shapes were indistinct, like smudges on an old photograph, but their applause began to echo once more, building in intensity until it became deafening. It felt like they were demanding something from me, something I didn't understand. Then I heard it, a voice low and resonant, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "The show must go on," it said. My knees buckled, and I fell to the stage, the words reverberating in my head like a command. The figures closed in around me, their movements almost mechanical, as if they were pieces of some ancient machine. The lights above me burned brighter, their heat unbearable, and I thought for sure I'd pass out. But just as the figures reached out, their faceless heads looming over me, everything went black. When I came to, the stage was dark, and the oppressive heat was gone. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it all, but the faint hum of the theater's electrical system brought me back to reality. I was lying flat on the stage, staring up at the rafters. My entire body ached, like I'd been running a marathon. Slowly, I got to my feet, my legs trembling under me. The figures were gone, and the seats were empty again. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. I staggered off the stage and into the lobby, desperate to get out of that place. This time, the doors opened without resistance, letting in the cool pre-dawn air. As I stumbled outside, something on the wall caught my eye. One of the posters that had shown my image was still there, but it had changed. The version of me on the poster was smiling now, holding the grotesque mask I'd seen earlier. The words "the final act" were gone, replaced with a single phrase, "coming soon." My blood ran cold, but I couldn't bring myself to tear it down. I left without looking back, vowing never to return. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it was all a hallucination, stress combined with the eerie atmosphere of the old theater. But every now and then, I catch myself whistling that same mournful tune I'd heard in the corridors, and it feels like the theater hasn't quite let me go.